In the autumn of 1889, a cattle rancher named Elias Crow was riding the northern edge of the South Dakota Badlands when he saw something that stopped him cold. A boy, standing alone in the middle of that broken, empty country. No wagon behind him, no horse, no footprints leading in or out of the place where he stood. Just a child, maybe 9 years old, planted in the dirt with the wind pulling at clothes that nobody in the territory had ever seen before. The nearest town was 40 miles away. The nearest water was half a day's ride. A grown man could die out there without preparation. And here was a boy who looked like he had simply appeared, staring up at the striped rock formations like he expected them to move. Crow climbed down off his horse. He called out. The boy didn't run. He didn't cry. He turned and looked at the rancher with an expression that Crow would later describe as older than the child wearing it. And when Crow asked him the only question that mattered, "Where did you come from, son?" the boy raised one hand and pointed at the ground beneath his feet. Not at the horizon, not down the trail, at the earth itself. Crow took him home. He fed him, wrapped him in a blanket, and for 2 full days the boy barely said a word. Then, on the 3rd night, he began to talk. And what that child described, sitting by the fire in a rancher's cabin in 1889, was a city that had stood where the Badlands now sat, the people who had built it, and the others, the ones who came to take it all away, and to make sure nobody remembered it had ever been there at all. By the time the men in dark coats arrived to collect the boy, 3 separate people had written down his words. This is the story of what he said, and why almost every record of it vanished within a year of him saying it. Before we go any further, if you find yourself pulled into stories like this one, the ones that live in the gap between what we were taught and what actually happened, do one thing for me right now. Subscribe. This channel exists to dig up the accounts that got buried, the testimonies that got walked out of the record, and the questions nobody in charge wanted asked twice. There is a great deal more coming after this, and you are going to want to see where the whole thing leads. Subscribe, and let's continue. To understand why a boy standing alone in the Badlands matters, you have to understand what the Badlands actually are, because the name is not a joke, and it is not just marketing for tourists. The Lakota called that region Makosika, which translates roughly to land bad, or bad land. The French trappers who came through called it Les Mauvaises Terres à Traverser, the Badlands to cross. Everyone who ever laid eyes on the place, across every language and every century, arrived at the same conclusion independently. This ground is wrong, and when you look at it, you start to feel why. The Badlands are a maze of ridges and spires and dry channels carved out of pale, layered rock. Geologists will tell you it was formed by erosion over millions of years, water and wind cutting down through soft sediment. And that explanation is clean and simple and taught in every classroom in the country, but stand in the middle of it, the way that boy was standing, and something about the shapes refuses to sit right in the human eye. The formations have edges, corners, long straight runs of stone that look less like something water wore down and more like something that was built, and then buried, and then half uncovered again. That is the thought that never quite goes away out there. Not that the land eroded, but that something underneath it is trying to come back up, that the wind and the rain are not carving the shapes so much as uncovering them, that the Badlands are not a wasteland at all, but a ruin so old and so thoroughly buried that we mistook the tops of its towers for hills. Elias Crow was not a superstitious man. The records we have of him paint a picture of a hard, practical rancher who had buried 2 children of his own and had no patience for ghost stories. When he brought the boy home, his first assumption was the ordinary one. A wagon train had passed through, a family had died or scattered, and this child had wandered off and gotten lucky. That happened on the frontier. It was tragic and it was common. Crow expected the boy to name a town, a father, a wagon captain, something that could be checked against a record and closed. But the boy named none of those things, and the more time Crow spent with him, the more the ordinary explanation fell apart in his hands. The child did not know what a wagon train was. When Hannah, Crow's wife, showed him a picture of a locomotive in a newspaper, he studied it the way you would study an animal you had never seen, curious and a little afraid, and asked what it ate. He did not recognize money. He did not recognize a rifle, though he flinched from it. which is a different thing. He held a fork like it was a tool from a foreign trade. This was not a settler's child who had gotten lost. This was a child who had come from somewhere that had none of the things a settler's child would have known since birth. And on the third night, when he finally opened his mouth to speak in full, the first thing he said was not about where he came from. It was a warning. He looked at Hannah, who was banking the fire for the night, and he said, in clear and oddly formal English, "You should not light fires after the sun is down here. They see the smoke." And when Hannah asked him, gently, who sees the smoke, the boy said two words that his hosts would never forget. The others. Now, if that were the whole of it, we could file the whole thing away as the fevered imagination of a traumatized child. Children invent monsters. They personify their fear. A boy lost and starving in a wasteland, of course he would populate that emptiness with watchers in the dark. But the boy did not stop at a name. Over the following nights, in fragments, in answers to careful questions, in things he said in his sleep and things he said staring at the cabin wall, he built a description, and the description was specific. It was consistent. It did not change the way an invented story changes when a child is asked to tell it twice. He said the same things the same way, night after night, until the people in that cabin started writing them down because they did not know what else to do with what they were hearing. He said the city had a name, but that the name could not be spoken anymore, because speaking it aloud was how the others found you. He said the buildings were made of a white stone that held light, so that the streets glowed softly after the sun went down and nobody in the whole city ever needed a lamp. He said the water had moved through the streets on its own, climbing up as easily as it ran down, through channels of copper and something he had no word for. He said the tallest towers had pulled power out of the open air, out of the sky itself, so that the entire city hummed, a low sound underneath everything that you stopped hearing after a while, because it never once stopped, like the sound of your own blood in your ears. And then he said the humming stopped, all at once, on a single day. He said the sky changed colour first, went a shade that he could not describe and kept trying to and failing, reaching for words a 9-year-old did not have. He said a wind came that was not weather. And he said that after the wind passed over, the people who were still standing could not remember. Not the way you forget a name, the way you forget you ever had a name at all. He said his own mother looked at him across the street and did not know his face. He said he called out to her and she looked through him like glass. And he said he ran and he kept running. And when he finally stopped and turned around, the city was already going down into the ground, sinking, as if the earth had simply opened its mouth and drawn the whole of it down out of the world. He was found, remember, standing on that ground, pointing down at it, telling a rancher that he had come from below. There is one more detail from those first nights, and it is the one that Hannah Crow found hardest to write about, because it was the one she could not explain away as the raving of a lost child. On the 4th or 5th night, the boy knelt down on the packed dirt floor of the cabin and, with one finger, he began to draw. He drew for a long time, in silence, and what he drew was a city. Not a child's scribble of a city, boxes and stick trees. A plan. Streets that ran in long, clean curves and met at precise angles. A great circle at the centre, ringed by what he said were the towers that pulled the power from the sky. Channels threading between the districts, which he pointed to and said, "That is where the water went up," and around the whole of it a wall shaped in points, like a star, that he said kept the light in and the dark out. He labelled nothing, because he could not write, but he named each part aloud as he drew it, patiently, the way a person names the rooms of a house they grew up in and could walk through blind. And Hannah wrote that the strangest thing was not the drawing itself, detailed as it was. The strangest thing was that when the boy finished, he sat back and looked at it for a while, and then he reached out and dragged his palm across the whole thing, wiping it out, erasing it completely from the dirt. And when she asked him why he had destroyed something so careful, he said that you must never leave the shape of it where they can see. He said that leaving the shape was how they knew you still remembered. And then he smoothed the floor flat with both hands, until there was no trace at all that anything had ever been drawn there, and he would not draw it again, no matter how gently she asked. He had shown them the city once, and once was already a risk. That was the boy's whole world, laid out and then rubbed away in the space of an hour, on the floor of a rancher's cabin, by a child who understood, better than any of the adults watching him, that the most dangerous thing a person can do is remember out loud. There were other things too, smaller things, that Hannah could not fit into any ordinary picture of a lost child. The boy would not sleep near a window, he asked, every single night, whether the fire was fully out, and he would not settle until he had watched the last ember go dark with his own eyes. He never once asked to go home, the way a lost child asks, over and over, tearfully, for a mother and a father and a familiar bed. He seemed to understand, in a way no 9-year-old should, that there was no home left anywhere to ask for. And when Elias, trying to be kind, told him that they would find his people, that someone somewhere must surely be looking for him, the boy only shook his head slowly and said that no one was looking, because no one was left alive who remembered he had ever existed at all. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the boy's testimony, the exact words he spoke on that third night by the fire, the map he scratched into the dirt floor of the cabin before the doctor arrived, and the names and dates of the 3 men who signed him out of the county record and were never once seen with him afterward, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to take a story like this and simply believe it, and belief is not what this channel is about. This channel is about the record. So let me tell you what the record actually contains, because that is the point where this stops being a campfire story and starts being a genuine problem that will not go away no matter how you turn it. 3 people wrote down the boy's words in that cabin. Elias Crow himself, in the back pages of a ranch ledger that otherwise recorded cattle sales and weather. Hannah Crow, his wife, in a run of letters she sent that winter to her sister in Ohio. And a third man, a circuit doctor named Josiah Bell, who was called out to the ranch about 10 days after the boy was found because the child had stopped eating and Crow was frightened he would die. Bell kept a professional casebook, and the boy in the Badlands got a long entry in it, written in the dry, clinical hand of a 19th century physician who had no reason on earth to embellish a single word. 3 sources, 3 completely different kinds of people. A rancher, a farm wife, a country doctor, writing in 3 different documents for 3 different reasons, none of them sitting down together to agree on how to tell it. And all 3 accounts agree on the details that matter most: the white stone that held light, the water that climbed, the power pulled out of the sky, the single day the humming stopped, and the forgetting. The forgetting is in all 3, described almost the same way each time. That is not how a lie spreads. A lie spreads by copying, and copies drift, and the drift is how you catch them. When 3 independent witnesses record the same strange thing without coordinating, and the details do not drift, historians normally treat that as strong evidence that something real was described, whatever that something turns out to be. We would accept that standard without blinking for a battle, or a storm, or a crime witnessed by 3 strangers on a street corner. The only reason we hesitate to accept it here is that what these 3 described does not fit the story we have all been told about the year 1889 and the ground it happened on. To sit with what the boy described, you have to understand what year it actually was and what the official story of that place claims about it. In 1889, South Dakota became a state. That November, it entered the Union, and the ceremonies and the newspapers and the speeches all treated that ground as raw, empty, freshly opened frontier. The story of the American West, the one every single one of us grew up inside, is a story of emptiness being filled, wagons rolling into land where nothing was, pioneers raising the first structures ever to stand on that soil, a wilderness that had never known a city being tamed for the first time by people who arrived with nothing and built everything. But the boy was describing a city. On that exact ground, a city with glowing streets and climbing water and power drawn out of the sky, that had stood and fallen and been buried before the first wagon ever creaked over the horizon. And here is the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up. He is not the only source that points in that direction. He is one of many. He just happens to be one who could talk. Across the whole of the 19th century, all over the American continent, settlers kept digging into supposedly virgin ground and hitting things that were not supposed to be there. In the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, they found earthworks so vast and so precisely geometric that the men measuring them assumed at first they had to be natural formations, until they walked the perimeters and found perfect circles 1,000 feet across, and squares aligned exactly to the compass, and mounds arranged in patterns that tracked the movement of the moon across an 18-year cycle. The official response was to credit these to peoples who were then, very conveniently, described as long vanished, and to move on quickly and build a farm on top. But the settlers who actually stood inside those earthworks wrote letters home that did not sound like men looking at a few interesting old hills. They sounded like men standing in the ruins of something enormous that their history books had left no room for at all. The Badlands boy fits into that same seam in the record. The exact seam where the official story insists nothing was here, and the ground itself keeps quietly saying otherwise, in earthworks and buried floors and pale stone with edges too straight to be an accident of the rain. Consider what the men who first surveyed those valley earthworks actually recorded, before the tidy explanations were fitted over the top of them. They found copper that had been mined out of the earth in quantities so vast that the pits ran for miles, ancient workings emptied of thousands of tons of metal, and no one could say where all that copper had gone, because the peoples credited with the mining left behind almost none of it. Thousands of tons of refined copper, dug up with enormous effort and skill, and then simply absent, vanished off the face of the continent, as if it had all been gathered up and carried somewhere by hands that history does not record. The boy said the water in his city moved through channels of copper. He said it plainly, more than once, in all three accounts. A child who came from nowhere named the exact metal that a whole continent's worth of ancient mining had produced, and then mysteriously misplaced. Sit with that alignment for a moment before you let it slide past you. And the earthworks themselves were not merely large, they were aligned. Surveyors found that the great mounds and enclosures pointed at things, at the rising of particular stars, at the turning points of the sun across the year, at the long, slow 18-year wobble of the moon, a cycle so subtle that you cannot possibly notice it by casual watching, that you can only find by keeping precise written records across an entire human lifetime and comparing them. Whoever raised those works was not a scattered band of primitives stacking dirt. They were astronomers. They were engineers keeping century-long records and building them into the landscape at a scale you can only fully see from the air, which is to say, from a vantage point the official story says none of them ever had. And then that knowledge, that patient, generational mathematical knowledge, is credited to a convenient vanished people and quietly set aside, and a farm is ploughed across the top of it, and the children who grow up on that farm are taught that the land was empty when their grandfathers came. The boy said the same thing was done to his city, built by people who knew the sky, buried, and then explained away until the burial itself was forgotten and only the flat, ploughed, empty story remained on top. There is one question I have avoided until now, because the accounts themselves circle it warily, and that question is the simplest one of all. What, exactly, were the others? The boy was asked, of course. Hannah asked him gently, and Elias asked him plainly, and the boy's answers were the one part of his testimony that never came easily to him. He said they were not animals and not men, but that they wore the shape of men when they wished to be seen, and the shape of nothing at all when they did not. He said you could stand in a room with one and feel it there, a pressure behind the eyes, a cold that came from no open window, and turn around and find the room empty. He said they did not walk so much as arrive. And then he said the thing that Hannah underlined twice in her letter, the thing she wrote she wished she had never heard, that the others did not hate the people of the city. Hatred, the boy said, would have been a kind of attention, and attention was a kind of memory, and the others did not remember the people any more than a man remembers the grass he cuts. They were not cruel. They were something worse than cruel. They were indifferent, and they were thorough. And when they were finished with a place, there was simply nothing left to say about it, which was, the boy said, the entire point of them. Let me tell you about the stone, because the stone is where this gets genuinely hard to wave away. The boy said the city was built of a white stone that held light. In her letters, Hannah Crow wrote that when she asked the boy to show her what he meant by that, he took a piece of chalky white rock from the ground outside the cabin, a common enough thing in that country, and he held it up in the full sun for a long time, patiently, turning it. And then he cupped his hands around it in the dark corner of the room and told her to come and look. And she wrote plainly, in a private letter meant only for her sister and no one else, that the rock glowed, faintly, a green-white colour, for the space of a few slow breaths, and then it faded back to nothing. Now, there is a mineral that does exactly this. It absorbs light and then releases it slowly in the dark, and we have a name for the phenomenon now, and we know that certain stones and certain treated materials do it on their own. So perhaps the boy simply knew which local rock would perform that quiet trick, and perhaps Hannah, a lonely and overworked farm wife, wrote it up in a letter with a little more wonder than it strictly deserved. That is possible, and I want to be genuinely fair to that reading, because the moment you stop being fair to the ordinary explanation, you have stopped thinking, but then sit with the fuller shape of it. A boy appears out of nowhere, from ground that has no footprints leading to it. He describes a lost city built of glowing white stone, and then he reaches down and lifts a piece of glowing white stone off the very ground he claims that city is buried beneath, and hands it to a woman and shows her it is true. Whatever that is, it is not nothing. It sits there in her own handwriting, waiting. And the water. He said the water climbed, that it moved up through the city as easily as it ran down. For most of human history, that single sentence would be treated as pure childish fantasy, because water does not climb, water falls. Every person who has ever spilled a cup knows this in their bones. Except that we now build our entire civilization on the fact that water can absolutely be made to climb, through pressure, through pumping, through principles of hydraulics that the ancient world understood far more deeply than we are taught in school. The Romans moved water uphill across whole landscapes. Structures across the old world are threaded through with channels and siphons that carried water in directions gravity alone would never have taken it. The boy was not describing magic when he said the water climbed. He was describing engineering. Advanced, confident, everyday engineering. The kind that the story of the empty and primitive frontier says could not possibly have existed on that patch of ground before the settlers arrived to invent it. And the power from the sky. This is the detail that, for a long time, people found the very easiest to dismiss, and it is also the detail that has aged the strangest of all of them. He said the towers pulled power out of the open air, out of the sky, and that the whole city hummed with it, day and night. In 1889 that was simply gibberish. There was no framework in the popular mind to even understand the claim, let alone test it. But within only a few years of that boy speaking those exact words by a rancher's fire, a man was standing on a stage in front of the world proposing to do precisely that, to draw electrical power out of the atmosphere itself and to transmit it through the open air without any wires at all, to light entire cities from great towers that pulled their energy straight from the sky. That man built one of those towers. It was enormous. By the accounts of people who stood near it, it hummed, and then it was torn down, and the full promise of it was pushed steadily to the very edges of the official story of how we came to be powered, until most people alive today have never heard the real version of it at all, only a sanitized footnote about a brilliant man who failed. I am not going to stand here and tell you that a 9-year-old boy in 1889 had somehow read the future of electrical engineering in advance. I am telling you something stranger and harder to explain than that. The specific, precise, technical thing he described, power drawn from the open sky and pushed through the air without wires, was not the fantasy it looked like at the time he described it. It was a real idea, pursued in earnest by real and serious people, and then quietly and thoroughly buried, in exactly the same way he said his city was buried. The pattern is the thing to watch. Over and over, the same pattern repeats, something advanced, something that genuinely worked, or nearly did, and then something, someone, that made it go away, and made us forget it had ever been within reach at all. That word again, forget. Dr. Josiah Bell, the circuit physician, arrived at the Crow Ranch roughly 10 days after the boy was found. His casebook survives, and his entry on the boy is the coldest and most clinical of the 3 accounts, which is exactly why it is also the most disturbing to read. Bell was not interested in lost cities or in the others. He was interested in a starving child who would not eat, and he examined the boy the way a good doctor examines a patient, methodically, writing as he went. And in the course of that examination, Bell recorded 3 specific physical things that a physician of his era had no framework to explain and absolutely no reason to invent. First, the boy's teeth. Bell wrote that the child's teeth were unlike any he had ever seen in a frontier child, or, he added, in any child anywhere, no decay whatsoever, no wear, and filled, in 2 places, with a hard pale substance that Bell could not identify by sight or by touch, set into the tooth with a precision he described in his own words as finer than any dentistry then practiced anywhere he had knowledge of. Read that again slowly. A 9-year-old, alone on the frontier, in 1889, carrying dental work in his mouth more advanced than the finest clinics of the eastern cities could produce for the wealthiest patient alive. Bell had no explanation. He simply wrote down exactly what he saw and admitted, in writing, that he could not account for it. Second, the boy's hands. Bell noted that the palms and the fingers showed no calluses at all, none of the labour, none of the ordinary marks that every single frontier child carried by that age, but that the very tips of the fingers bore faint, regular ridges of old scarring, as though the boy had spent long hours pressing his fingertips against something smooth and hard and slightly warm. When Bell asked him about it, the boy said, quietly, that he used to make the walls listen. Bell wrote that down too, those exact 5 words, and then he wrote in the margin beside it, meaning unclear, and moved on, because there was nothing else a rational man could do with a sentence like that. And third, the thing Bell circled twice in his own casebook with his own pen, which is not a thing a careful and economical physician does lightly to his own professional notes. When Bell asked the boy his age, a routine question, the simplest question in the world, the boy said that he did not know how old he was, because time had not moved the same way in the place he came from as it moved here. And then he said something that Bell recorded, word for word, and then circled, twice. He said, "I have been 9 for a long time." Before we move on to the men who came for the boy, stop for a second. What you just heard about the boy's teeth, his hands, and the sentence the doctor circled twice is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the doctor's own casebook pages, the dental impossibility, the fingertip scarring. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. I have been 9 for a long time. A traumatized, half-starved child says a great many strange and frightening things, and a wise adult learns not to build a cathedral on top of any one of them. But a doctor, writing coldly and privately in a professional casebook he never once expected another living soul to read, does not stop and circle a single sentence twice, unless that sentence reached up off the page and did something to him. Bell was a rational man in the most rational profession his century had produced. He wrote that sentence down, and he marked it again, and then, as we know from everything that came afterward, he found that he could not simply let it go the way a sane man is supposed to let such things go. Because Josiah Bell is the entire reason this story did not simply stay buried in the back of a rancher's cattle ledger. Bell went home from that ranch, and he could not sleep, and he began to write letters to colleagues. To a small scientific and medical society he corresponded with back east, the kind of gentlemen's association that exchanged curiosities and case notes by post. He described the boy in careful detail, the teeth, the hands, the account of the buried city built of glowing stone, and he asked, in writing, in plain professional language, whether any of his correspondents had ever encountered anything even remotely similar. He was a man of science doing exactly what a man of science is supposed to do when he touches the edge of something he cannot explain. He reached out, honestly, to find out whether anyone else had ever brushed against the same impossible edge. And that, as far as we can reconstruct it from the record, is the precise moment the men in dark coats came. Here is what we can piece together about those men. And I want to be completely honest with you about the limits of the record here, because this is exactly where it goes thin, and it goes thin in a way that is itself the loudest evidence in the whole account. Hannah Crow's letters, which had been full of the boy all through that late autumn, stopped mentioning him abruptly in the early part of the winter, not gradually, not with any resolution or goodbye. In one letter she is writing page after page about him, worried and fascinated, quoting his words back to her sister, describing the glowing stone. And then in the very next surviving letter, sent a few weeks later, there is a single flat line about him buried in the middle of ordinary news. It reads, "The boy is gone. The men came for him on Tuesday. Elias says we are not to speak of it, so I will not write of him again." And she never does. Not once, in any letter that survives, for the remaining 40 years of her life. Elias Crow's ledger does the very same thing, in its own way. There are entries about the boy, dated, matter of fact, tucked in between cattle prices and notes on the weather, what the boy ate, that the boy would not eat, that the doctor was sent for. And then, abruptly, there is an entry in a different hand, a harder and heavier hand than Crow's own, that reads simply, "Matter closed." And after those two words, nothing. The ledger itself continues for years and years. Cattle, weather, births, sales, the ordinary rhythm of a working ranch. But the boy, who fills its pages for a season, is never written of again after another man's hand wrote matter closed across the account and shut it. And Dr. Josiah Bell. Bell's casebook, kept faithfully for well over a decade in the same steady hand, ends 3 weeks after his letters went east. Not the entry on the boy, the entire casebook. The final dated entry in Josiah Bell's professional life is a routine house call about a broken arm, and then the book simply stops mid-year, with a good many blank pages still remaining. We know Bell lived another 20 years, because there is a death record with his name on it. But he apparently never kept a casebook again for the rest of his life. A meticulous man who had documented his working existence for more than 10 unbroken years set down his pen forever within a single month of asking the wrong people one honest question. 3 people. 3 separate records, kept for 3 different reasons in 3 different hands, and all 3 severed at almost exactly the same moment, in the same winter, in the same way. Not destroyed. That is the detail I cannot get past. If someone had simply burned these documents, we would have nothing, and we would suspect nothing, because you cannot miss what you never knew existed. But the records were not burned. They were stopped. The ledger kept going with the boy erased out of it. The letters kept flowing to Ohio with the boy forbidden from appearing in them. The casebook was closed but left whole, blank pages and all, to survive on a shelf for a century. Somebody did not want these documents gone. Somebody wanted them silent. And there is a world of difference between the two, and that difference is the whole story. Because think about what the boy said the others actually did. He did not say they killed everyone in the city. He did not say they burned it to the ground. He said they made people forget. He said the worst thing they did was not destruction at all, it was erasure. His own mother, standing in the street, looking directly at his face and no longer knowing it. The city going down into the ground, not in fire and screaming, but in silence, as if it had been edited cleanly out of the world. And then a rancher, a farm wife, and a country doctor, all 3, within a single quiet winter, going silent about the one thing that had ever happened to them that they could not explain. Their records left standing, but emptied of the boy. The exact method the boy had described worked one more time on the only 3 people who had listened to him describe it. I do not say that lightly, and I am not going to tell you what to make of it, because the moment I tell you what to believe, I have become just another smooth voice filling the hole with a tidy story. I am only showing you the shape of the pattern and asking you to feel for yourself how tightly it fits. Now let me pull back, because the boy in the Badlands is not an isolated event floating alone in history. He is one point on a map, and a single point proves nothing, and anyone who builds a whole worldview on one strange child is a fool. But there are other points, many of them, and when you set them down side by side, a line begins to appear between them, and the line runs off in a direction that none of us were ever taught to look. All across the 19th century, and pushing on into the early 20th, there is a phenomenon that sits in the records in plain sight, one that historians will acknowledge case by case, but almost never assemble into a whole, so that the pattern never gets the chance to stand up and be seen. Children found alone, children who could not, or would not, say where they had come from. Children who spoke of places that did not appear on any map, in ways too detailed and too internally consistent to be simple invention, and who displayed knowledge or abilities they had no earthly way of possessing. In Europe there was a famous one, a young man who appeared in a town square one day holding a letter, who could barely speak at first, who claimed to have been kept his entire life in a single dark room, and who described things and grasped things he should never have been able to know, and who was, in the end, murdered in the open by persons never identified, right at the moment when people of standing and influence had begun to take his impossible story seriously. The pattern rhymes across the whole century. A child appears from nowhere. The child knows too much, or remembers too much, or is too much. Serious, credentialed people begin, cautiously, to listen. And then, reliably, the record goes dark. And there is more, much more. And this is where the boy's story reaches out and touches the larger thing that this channel has circled for years, and touches it for good reason. Across those same decades, in great cities on both sides of the ocean, there are the structures. Buildings that stood in supposedly young and primitive cities that were somehow far too grand, too vast, too intricately ornamented, too enormous for the populations and the technology and the timelines the official story is willing to grant. Immense exposition halls and World's Fair palaces thrown up, we are told, in a matter of a few short months, structures the size of small cities, built of gleaming white stone, or something painted to look like it, and lit up at night with more electric light than the era is supposed to have been remotely capable of generating, and then, within a year or two, torn back down, hauled away, and described forever afterward as temporary, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to build a white and glowing city the size of a district, and then immediately unbuild it and let the memory of it fade to a handful of photographs. The boy said the city was built of white stone that held light, and that the streets glowed at night without any lamps. And a few years after he said those words to a rancher and a doctor, a white city rose beside a great inland lake, a city of pale gleaming stone that glowed after dark with a scale of electric light that stunned everyone who travelled to see it, that was called by nearly every witness the most beautiful thing they had ever laid eyes on, and that was then, almost in its entirety, demolished, torn down and carted off within a couple of years of opening, until we are left with a scatter of old photographs and a strange, low, nagging sense in the back of the mind that we have never once been given a satisfying answer to the simplest question. Why would anyone build something so vast and so beautiful and so advanced only in order to immediately and deliberately unbuild it? And, under the cities, the mud. This is the detail that, once you truly see it, you can never stop seeing, in every old city you walk through for the rest of your life. All over the old world and the new, there are buildings whose ground floors sit below the current level of the street, whose original front doors are now half a story underground, whose first row of windows peeks up from below the pavement like eyes just breaking the surface of dark water. The official explanation is always local, always different, always reasonable on its own. The city raised the street for drainage, they filled it in for the sewer lines, the ground simply settled. And any one of those, taken alone, sounds sensible, and you nod and move on. But it is not one city, it is everywhere, on every continent. The same buildings, sunk to nearly the same depth, as though a single tide of earth had rolled silently across the entire face of the world at once, buried the ground floor of everything that stood, and then receded, leaving us on top of it to invent 100 separate local explanations for one enormous event that nobody is permitted to name out loud. The boy said the city went down into the ground. He said the earth opened its mouth and swallowed it whole. What if that was never a metaphor at all? What if a frightened child was describing, in the only plain words a child could reach for, the very thing whose evidence is sitting silently under the sidewalks of half the old cities on earth at this exact moment? The buried floor, the sunken door, the window below the street, the mud that came and covered and then withdrew and left just enough of the top sticking up above the surface to remind us, if we ever once chose to stop and truly look, that something down there is far older and far stranger than the tidy story we were handed at birth and told to stop asking about. And there is one more shape in the record that the boy's account reaches toward, and it is perhaps the strangest of all: the star forts. Across the entire world, on every inhabited continent, you find them. Enormous, precise, perfectly geometric fortifications shaped like many pointed stars, built to a nearly identical design and a nearly identical mathematics, in places that supposedly had no contact with one another, raised by cultures, the official story says, never spoke and never shared a single blueprint. The same precision, the same star geometry, the same scale, repeated across thousands of miles of ocean and centuries of supposed isolation. We are told they were simply an efficient design for defense, and each one is credited to whatever local power stood nearest to it when the modern record begins. But stand inside the mathematics of them, and the coincidence strains to breaking. It looks less like many peoples independently arriving at the same idea, and far more like the scattered fragments of one vanished civilization that once spanned the globe, whose common engineering and common hand were erased, leaving only the stone behind, too heavy to bury completely, distributed everywhere, credited to everyone, and therefore, in the end, credited to no one at all. That is the other's true weapon, if the boy was telling the plain truth. It was never the burying, it was the explaining. Every buried building has its own reasonable local explanation. Every lost white city has its tidy reason it was demolished. Every impossible star fort has its comfortable attribution to whatever power stood nearby. The forgetting, you see, does not arrive as a blank space, an empty hole where the memory used to be. A blank would itch and demand to be filled by an honest search. So instead, the forgetting arrives as a story, a smooth, reasonable, slightly boring story that slides into the hole and fills it so completely that you never once suspect there was a hole there at all. You do not forget the city. You remember instead a swamp that was helpfully drained, a fair that was always meant to be temporary, a mound raised by a convenient people who conveniently vanished. The true memory is not erased and left empty. It is quietly replaced with a false one. And a replaced memory is far more dangerous than a missing one, because a missing memory drives a person to dig, while a replaced memory sits perfectly satisfied and never asks a single further question for the rest of your life. Which brings us back, at last, to the boy, and to the one final thing he said, the thing Dr. Bell recorded in the last hours before the men arrived, the thing I have held back until now, so that it would land with the full weight it deserves. On the last night before the men in dark coats came, the night bell was still out at the ranch watching over the boy. The doctor asked him one final question. He asked him why. If the others could truly do all of this, if they could bury an entire city in silence and empty a mother's own memory of her only son, then why leave anyone behind at all? Why leave him? Why leave a single living child to wander up onto the surface and be found by a rancher and start telling the whole story to anyone who would sit still and listen? And the boy, according to Bell's own casebook, was quiet for a long time before he answered. And then he said that the others did not make mistakes, that if he had been left behind, alive, on the surface, then being left behind was not an error, it was part of the design. He said that a story which has no survivor is not truly buried. It is only hidden. And a hidden thing can always be found again by accident, stumbled over, dug up by someone who was not even looking for it. But a story that has one survivor, one lone child who escapes and comes up into the light and tells the whole truth plainly and is not believed, that story is buried forever, because now the story has a witness, and the witness is dismissed as mad. And the dismissal itself becomes the final proof that nothing ever happened. The boy said, and Bell wrote it down word for word in his cold clinical hand, "They let me go so that I would be the reason no one believes." Sit inside that sentence for a moment. Let it turn all the way around. The boy claimed that his own survival, the very fact of him standing there alive and talking, was not the one crack in the erasure, it was the final stroke of it. He was not a leak in the great forgetting. He was the seal that closed it and made it permanent. Because a lone child telling an impossible story about a buried city is not, to any reasonable adult, evidence that the city was real. He is evidence, instead, that only a delusional child could ever believe such a city was real. He does not open the door for us. He closes it gently and locks it and hands us the reassuring comfort of calling him mad, so that not one of us ever has to work up the nerve to try the handle ourselves. If that is true, then everything about the strange way this story reached us suddenly makes a terrible kind of sense. Of course, the 3 records were left standing but silenced, rather than seized and burned. Of course, the boy was collected quietly by unnamed men rather than killed loudly in a way that would leave a body and a question. A murder is an event. An event gets noticed and investigated and remembered. But a strange, unclaimed child, taken away one Tuesday, mentioned a single time in a farm wife's letter, and then never again, is not an event. It is a loose thread that ties itself into a knot. It is a story that quietly discredits itself in the act of being told, which is exactly what the boy swore the others do. They do not hide the truth down in the darkness, where a brave person might go looking with a lamp. They hide it in the open light of day, wrapped in just enough strangeness that no reasonable person will ever agree to carry it one step further. And yet, here we are, carrying it further anyway. Because there is one thing the others, if they are real, could never fully account for: time. They silenced 3 records in the winter of 1889, but they left the records themselves standing, and a record outlives the reason it was silenced. The ledger sat quiet in a box for decades, the letters sat quiet in an attic in Ohio, the casebook sat quiet on a shelf with its blank pages waiting, and the years rolled on, and the men in dark coats grew old and died, and the living reason for the silence died in the ground along with them. But the documents did not die, and they did not know they were supposed to stay quiet. They sat there, patient and blank, in exactly the place where the boy should have been, until at last someone came along who noticed the blankness. Someone who thought to ask why a meticulous doctor set down his pen forever in the same month, a rancher's ledger changed hands mid-page, and a woman's flowing letters went suddenly silent about the one child she had not been able to stop writing about the month before. The erasure was good. It was very, very good. But it was not perfect, because a perfect erasure leaves nothing behind at all, and these people did not leave nothing. They left the exact shape of a thing removed, the clean outline of an absence, and a shape can be read by anyone patient enough to trace it. What became of the boy after the men took him away, we do not know. There is no record, and I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Every attempt to trace him forward runs straight to the edge of the Crow Ranch in the winter of 1889 and simply stops. The way the letters stop, the way the ledger stops, the way the casebook stops, all at once, at the same wall. He was 9 years old, or he had been 9 for a very long time, and then he was gone, and the country he was found standing in became a state, and built roads and towns, and eventually a national park around the very rock formations he had stood among. Millions of people have walked through the Badlands since, past those striped walls of pale stone with their 2 straight edges and their long buried corners, and almost none of them have ever heard that a boy was found out there, pointing down at the ground, telling everyone who would listen that a city lay sleeping beneath their feet. I keep coming back to the last thing Hannah Crow ever wrote about him in the days before the silence closed over her forever. It was not about the city, or the others, or the glowing stone in her dark corner. It was smaller than any of that, and somehow, for being smaller, it is far worse. She wrote that on his last night in her house, the boy asked her not to forget him, that he said everyone always forgot that this was the thing that happened to him wherever he went, that people would listen and be amazed and moved, and then a little time would pass, and it would be as if he had never spoken a word at all, as if the whole of what he said had somehow slid right off the surface of the world and left no mark anywhere. And he begged her, please, whatever comes, do not let them make you forget. And she promised him that she would not. She wrote the promise down in her own hand, in a letter to her sister, so that it would be real and witnessed and kept. And then the men came on a Tuesday, and she never wrote of him again, and she lived another 40 years, and, as far as any surviving letter shows, never once spoke his name aloud again. The one person who promised to remember him was made to forget, in exactly the way the boy had said it always happened. Her promise is still there, though. Right there in the letter, in her own careful hand, sitting a few inches of paper above the silence that swallowed it. You can read them both on the same page if you ever find it. The vow to remember, and then, directly below it, the nothing. So, maybe the boy was simply a lost, half-starved child who told a beautiful and terrible story to fill the emptiness he had been thrown into, and the coincidences pile up the way they always do when a person badly wants them to, and there is nothing here but one sad chapter in an extraordinarily hard century. That is the reasonable reading, and I will not take it from you. Part of me hopes with everything I have that it is the true one, because the alternative does not let any of us sleep quite as soundly ever again. But then I think about the pattern. The 3 records severed the same way in the same season. The buildings sunk to the same depth on every continent. The white cities built to glow and then torn down within a year. The star forts scattered identical across a world that supposedly never spoke to itself. The power pulled from the open sky, described by a child years before it was proposed by a genius, and then buried like everything else that ever worked. The children who keep appearing, knowing far too much and getting silenced the moment serious people begin to listen. And most of all, the boy's own final claim, the one that turns the whole key in the whole lock, that his survival was not the failure of the erasure, that it was its most complete stroke, that he was let go, alive, on purpose, so that the truth would have a witness too strange ever to be believed. Because if he was right about that, then every person who ever heard his story and dismissed him only made him more correct. And the only way to ever prove him wrong is to refuse the exact comfort he said he was designed to give us. To not call him mad, to not let a smooth story fill the hole all the way to the top. To leave the question open, and let it itch, and carry it a little further down the road than the frightened people before us were permitted to carry it. That is what Hannah Crow promised on the last night, with the fire dying and the boy watching her face. Do not let them make you forget. She could not keep it. She was flesh, and the men came, and the long winter closed over her, and the silence took her promise, the way that silence takes everything soft and human that stands in its path. But Hannah Crow is not the last person who ever heard the boy's story. You are. It came down through the ledger, and the letters, and the cold clinical casebook, past the men in dark coats and the long decades of gathering dust, past everyone who was ever paid or frightened into forgetting it, all the way down the chain to this exact moment, to you, sitting there right now, hearing it. The chain the others tried to snap clean through in 1889 did not actually snap. It bent and went quiet, and waited in a box and an attic and a shelf, and it reached you anyway, against everything. Which means the promise Hannah made is not dead. It only changed hands. It was passed down the line, in the dark, and now it is sitting in yours. So, here is the only thing I will ask of you before we end, not to believe. Belief was never the point, and a story that demands your belief is usually the one you should trust the least. I am asking you to remember, to carry the shape of the thing that was removed, to walk past some old building one ordinary afternoon and notice that its first floor is somehow half underground, and to let yourself wonder, for one honest second, why. To hear the tidy explanation, and to not let it close the hole all the way to the top. That is the whole task. The boy swore that the others win only by being forgotten. If that is true, then the single move they cannot counter is an ordinary person who simply, stubbornly refuses to forget. His name is not in any record I could find. They took even that from him in the end, the last small thing he owned. But the shape of him is still there, pressed into 3 documents that were silenced, but never quite destroyed, pointing down at the ground exactly the way he pointed at it that first day, telling us that a city is down there, under the pale striped stone and the 2 straight edges, sleeping, waiting, the way he swore it was waiting, for someone at last to look at the Badlands with clear eyes and finally understand that the name was never a warning about the weather at all. If this reached something in you tonight, if you felt the floor tilt even slightly under you while you sat and listened, then do the one single thing that keeps a story like this one alive in the world. Subscribe and stay with this channel, because there are far more of these than you would ever guess. More children found where no child should be, more records silenced but not burned, more buildings sunk to the same strange depth on the same strange day, more cities built to glow and then torn quietly down. And I am going to keep pulling them up out of the ground, one at a time, for as long as you keep watching alongside me." The boy asked one person to remember him, and she was made to forget. But there are many more of us now, gathered in the dark together. Let us see them try to make all of us forget at once. I will see you in the next one.